Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today I wanted to talk about something that's all over the news right now, and that is what's facing farmers, this new trade deal that was just struck between China and the US, what it means for farmers, and kind of where I see all of this going. What are farmers going to do?
It's not the first time this has happened. Soybean farmers were hammered during President Trump's first trade war with China in 2018. Now the administration is promising them another bailout.
We don't want the aid. We want the trade.
Gaffner says one-time relief is not a long-term solution.
If China starts buying elsewhere, which they are doing now, once they establish those trade routes, it becomes more difficult for them to come back to the U.S. to buy their commodities. Once we lose that, we may never get it back again. And that's huge for next generations.
Today is October 31st. Everybody's talking today about this new trade deal that was struck yesterday between China and the U.S. Now, I'd like to point out one thing, which is that actually no pen was put to paper. As far as I've heard, this is all just verbal agreements on all of this stuff, which of course makes it a little bit tenuous because there is a history of both parties kind of going back and forth on tariffs, on actual quantities purchased, et cetera, et cetera. And just for background, in case you're sitting here wondering, well, what qualifies you to talk about the economics of this? Just FYI, I have my master's degree in business from UC Irvine, and I actually studied macroeconomics under Peter Navarro, who's the senior economic advisor to the Trump administration. So yes, I kind of know what I'm talking about here. Also, of course, we have our farm here in Colorado, and we have our conventional soybean and corn farm out in Minnesota. So some of the headlines are saying that this is good news for farmers. Now, from where I stand, I would disagree with that. This is not as good as some of the headlines are making it seem, and it's definitely not as good as a lot of people who are commenting on some of my videos seem to think it is. Is this an enormous deal for the farmers? No. Is it a fabulous deal for the farmers? Definitely not. Let's talk about why. So this deal to me seems like a bit more of a partial reset instead of a improvement on what was happening before. So the agreement that was made yesterday basically resets us back to around half of what we were doing in 2004 in terms of trade with China, in terms of soybean exports. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about numbers on soybeans. So in the years before 2018, the US was a dominant supplier of soybeans to China. For a lot of the 2010s, China bought about 60% of our soybean exports. It was a huge part of our export revenue, and they were our biggest customer by far. So that gave us a degree of reliability during that decade. Now, production in the US over the last decade has been roughly 3.5 to 4.5 billion bushels. And it depends on the weather, how many acres are planted. It fluctuates a little bit every year. And those are numbers that we pulled from USDA data sets widely available. Now, entered 2018, tariffs started flying back and forth. These were enacted by Trump. The tariffs weren't just on steel and aluminum, they were also on agricultural goods. So China retaliated after we started putting these tariffs on, and they slapped tariffs on US imported soybeans. So the effect was massive of this. The US trade quantities to China plunged. In 2017, we shipped about $12.2 billion worth of soybeans to China, and in 2018, that fell to roughly $3.1 billion. So pretty substantial decrease. So it's a drop around 70 to 75% in one single year. And those buyers didn't just vanish, they just shifted. So in a lot of cases, they turned to Brazil and Argentina, and they have the land. Brazil in particular has gotten really good at growing soybeans and corn. They have a longer growing season, so they have gotten much more efficient at growing these things. So they stepped in to fill the gap. So they also were able to sell at lower prices because they did not have tariffs on their soybeans. So they were at a price advantage, and the logistics chain, when that happened, kind of changed around those new trade routes. So it's very difficult to rerun trade routes, to reestablish those trade partners, and once that's done, redoing it is difficult. So trade wars are not just political, they definitely have an impact on farmers and their bottom dollar. Peer-reviewed studies that estimate that tariffs and the trade war and retaliations lowered the U.S. soybean prices by about 74 cents a bushel on average during the initial months of retaliation. And that's small. It seems small per unit, but once you magnify that across billions of bushels, it's pretty significant. And we do need to remember that this was during 2018. This was actually the first Trump administration where this was happening, where this trade war was started. So we knew back in November, and quite honestly, you guys might remember my video that I posted back in, I think it was December, where we talked about what are we doing this year, what are we pivoting to, because I knew what was going to happen. A lot of people knew what was going to happen, which is that these trade wars were going to be started again. Why? Unclear.
What we need is trade and opportunity. Right now, we're at a 20% price disadvantage to the tariffs and the trade war to our counterparts in South America, and that just makes us uncompetitive and makes us lose the market. And we need a change, and we need it now.
China imports 61% of the global soybean supply, Caleb. If China doesn't start buying again from the U.S., tell me what's going to happen to you. Tell me what's going to happen to our economy.
We as American soybean farmers have a lot invested in infrastructure and the way we raise our crops, our crop rotations, and it's not something we can simply just jump around and dabble in one crop one year and something else the next. We have long-term processes that are in place, and American soybean farmers are really good at producing soybeans. What we need is strong markets and opportunity. China is our biggest export customer. Soybeans are the largest agriculture product that's exported. Many farmers, such as myself, have no other income other than our farms, and suddenly when your biggest customer just disappears, that's a dire circumstance. What we need is trade and opportunity. Right now, we're at a 20% price disadvantage to the tariffs and the trade war to our counterparts.
So if I knew back in November that this was going to happen, didn't the farmers know that this was going to happen? They should have. If they didn't know, then they were kidding themselves. This was very openly discussed. It seemed quite obvious to most of us that this was going to happen again. So why didn't farmers just pivot away from soybeans? Why didn't they pivot to another crop? Well, here's something that a lot of people who don't farm don't get. You can't just pivot overnight to a different crop. Planting decisions are often made months ahead, sometimes years ahead. Fertilizers are ordered, seeds are ordered. Could they have changed those seed orders? To an extent, yes. But a lot of this also comes down to mill availability. So for example, our home farm in Minnesota, there's corn mills close by, there's soybean mills close by, but there's really not much else. They're actually working on an oat mill, so that will open up another potential market. But right now, the system is set up for corn and soybeans. It's just the reality of farming in America now. Do I agree with that? No, I don't. I think that our farmers should be more diversified. It would definitely help in times like these. But the system just isn't quite set up for that. A lot of them have machinery that is millions upon millions of dollars that is dependent on growing certain crops. So with all the seed, fertilizer, machinery, contracts that are signed, it's not just like you can say, okay, well, we're going to try something else this year instead of these soybeans. It's just not that simple. So changing crops also requires rotation schedules, different pests, different weed controls, different cash flow timing. So if you switch from soybeans to something else, you might avoid one market risk, but you're taking on others. So on top of that, a lot of export markets have rules and certifications and other relationships. So if a Chinese buyer now contracts with Brazil's bean crushers and port system, that's not something you can just walk in and take back the next season. So it's not so easy as to say, well, why didn't they just not grow soybeans this year? Now, why did they vote for this? That I could not answer for you. I haven't really been able to get a good answer from any of our farmers that we work with. I'm not sure what they were expecting, to be honest. I don't know. If anyone wants to offer any clarity in the comments, I'm happy to hear it.
I started in 1986, the year I graduated high school. I could plant an acre of beans in 1986 for 30 bucks. It irritates me that you don't have the guts to acknowledge that the people do not pay the tariffs. I don't care if it's John Deere, Case, Caterpillar, all that stuff is outsourced overseas. And the guy that pays it is the guy that purchased it. I can buy a bearing for a combine and it's made in Taiwan or who knows where. Parts have over doubled in the last year. if you can get them. The dealer at Marshall has a backlog for almost 4 months because they can't get parts because of Trump's stupid tariffs. I think agriculture has taken a heck of a hit on a lot of misinformation, and he is not helping the farmer. I mean, we farm about 3,500 acres. We are going to be so far in the red. When are you going to stand up for us instead of kissing his ass for these trade deals? And the tariffs. More so the tariffs than the trade.
Okay, so another thing that pulls on farm bottom dollars, of course, is input costs. So input costs when you're planting, thousands of acres of anything are going to be high, especially when we're looking at things like fertilizers. So there are tariffs that are happening, obviously globally, macro shocks, global supply chain issues, especially after 2018 and again during the pandemic era. That all drove the cost of fertilizer and diesel and machinery costs way up. So, and then you look at Canada tariffs and potash, which is a main fertilizer source here in the US. Those tariffs definitely hit the farmer's bottom line, and those fertilizer markets have become very, very volatile. So this is one of the reasons why at our farm we are trying to pull away from that dependence on fertilizers, because those costs, those input costs are so volatile. They're very, very up and down. So the more you have to rely on them, the worse off you are. The less you're able to predict what is my revenue going to be next year. So what they're dealing with is margins shrinking on both sides, right? Because they're having higher input costs due to all these tariffs and volatile market situations. And then they're also dealing with a decreased market because we've lost one of our biggest buyers. So enter this deal with China. So when we hear Trump struck a deal with China, I know quite a few people were like, oh, good, this is great news for the soybean growers. And while it does help, it is a little bit. I'm going to put a slide on the screen that kind of shows the last 20 years or so of soybean exports. And you can see right around when those trade wars begin, how much China started sourcing from Brazil instead of from the US. So the deal that was struck yesterday actually was only for about 441 million bushels of soybeans, which if you look at it compared to this graph over the last 20 years, it's only about half of what we were exporting in 2004. Now, China has said for the next 3 years after that, they'll be doubling that. So about 2004 levels, not great. And this is just verbal. After the trade wars of 2018, China did the same thing. They came in and they said, well, we'll agree to ramp up our purchases over the next several years, but they didn't do that. And quite honestly, it's because America has proven itself an unstable trade partner. That isn't the farmer's fault. And this is one of the things that farmers are just subject to, is they don't have a lot of control over their own market. They can't really do a lot. If people are coming in and setting tariffs on stuff, they have no control over that. So that makes it really difficult for the farmers. Now, again, we knew this was going to happen, so riddle me this. Not sure why that was acceptable to them. I don't know. You can look at it like if your business lost customers 5 years ago and then they built relationships elsewhere with other companies, why would they all of a sudden come back? Especially if that company has proven itself unreliable. And that's what, for us as farmers, this is what I'm looking at is, sure, there might have been a trade deal struck. Remains to be seen how much is going to be actually adhered to. So, yes, there's a trade deal, but in my opinion, it's a Band-Aid, and it's not a very good Band-Aid anyway. So now let's talk about the other little piece of all this, which is Argentina, right? So you probably heard about this bailout that's going to Argentina to the tune of $40 billion. And that was in 2025. The U.S. agreed to help stabilize the Argentinian market. Now, why did we agree to do this? Rumors abound, right? That we needed to stabilize their economy. So this is going to hurt farmers. It already has hurt farmers, because once Argentina got that money, what they did is they turned around. So they lowered their price of soybeans, and China came in and bought a bunch of those soybeans at a lower price, because of course they did. Why not? They're in the business of saving money too. So when faced with a lower price product, they bought the soybeans from Argentina. This was a major slap in the face, because at this point, China had still bought 0 bushels of soybeans from the American farmers, where in the past they've been 60% of our soybean exports. This is a huge difference. And so for the U.S. to turn around and say, well, we don't know if we're doing a bailout yet for the farmers, but we're going to do a bailout for Argentina, and then they're going to turn around and they're going to sell their soybeans I'm not approaching this from the ranching side of things, but then of course this decision to bring in Argentinian beef, of course, plays into all of this for the ranching side of this community. The combination of these things, right? Cheaper Argentinian soybeans and U.S. financial aid to Argentina looked to a lot of American farmers like, why are we helping a direct competitor while we're still suffering the after effects of a trade war? So, okay, suppose that the U.S. wants to make farmers better, right? They want to make their situation better. So in 2018 to 2019, the Trump administration gave a big bailout to the farmers. I believe it was about $24 billion. And that was a trade aid package called the Market Facilitation Program that provided payments to farmers to offset the tariff losses. Now, those programs were fairly limited, and they didn't actually fully cover the lost market trade war. It's like a stopgap, and it was kind of to help stop the bleeding, but it didn't make up for the difference. And most farmers, when you talk to them in the field, what I found is that they really want the trade. They don't want to be on, social welfare. It really is what it is. They would prefer to have the market and to be able to sell their grain over having to take bailouts. Plus, a lot of these farmers are looking at this bailout that's being proposed that's been as a result of income from tariffs and saying, well, we paid into those tariffs. So to turn around and say, we're bailing you out with this money is a bit of a, well, just listen.
I have to ask, where do you stand on the White House's idea of helping farmers with tariff money that is being collected?
That's the most ridiculous thing. Let me explain to you.
Okay.
Or your listeners, excuse me. Those tariffs I'm paying on inputs just this spring, and all of our parts. Many of our parts come from other countries. All right. Just this spring, I go to my local John Deere dealer. I need a chain for my corn planter. I take it out of the box, John Deere box. Dealt with these people for 40 years. John Deere part number. Turn it over. It says made from China. Okay, I'm thinking, wow, that's odd. I just paid a tariff on that doggone thing. So here's the deal. I'm paying that tariff because my importer, John Deere, paid it. They paid it directly to the Treasury. Now the President of the United States is going to take my money and give it back to me and call it a bailout. That's just comical. And I tell you what, this administration has got agriculture, has got farmers exactly where they want them. And that is in need of what only Trump can deliver, and that's a bailout. What a terrible place for agriculture to be. Farmers are independent. They are independent businessmen and women, and they want to live off the land. They're creating income off the land for their communities, and President Trump has them right where he wants.
So right now, there's talk of another bailout for farmers, but it's uncertain because if Trump wants to use tariff money to do that, he actually has to do that through Congress. He has to go through Congress. It has to get approved. Supposedly, there's some rumors that they've found some money, at least to open up the USDA offices and help get aid out, but I don't know. And the problem is a lot of these farmers are very heavily debt leveraged. So they have, again, these $1 million machines, they have land rents, they have things that have bills due for them. And so if they are not able to pay those bills, they will go bankrupt. We'll talk about that in a second. So even if there is another financial aid program, it usually comes too late to help these heavily debt leveraged farmers. So it'll often come a year or two down the road. By that point, usually it's too late. They've already lost some of their farm. And bailouts carry political strings, of course. So they're not guaranteed to be structured to rebuild exports. They're immediate income support for a single year's losses, but they don't necessarily account for the fact that we're going to see repercussions from this for the next several years. Let's talk about bankruptcy and stress on farms last. The scariest part of all of this to me is the financial fallout for farmers. And farm bankruptcies ticked up significantly 2018, 2019, 2020, and it's only accelerating now. So in 2025, the Chapter 12 cases are rising. Many Federal Reserve District reports and state extension services are documenting bankruptcy filings and weaker loan repayments during the first half of 2025, which is not a good sign. And then by the second quarter of 2025, bankruptcy filings started to climb. Some reported almost double the filings from the prior year's quarters. So that is people losing generational farms. or being forced to restructure under very tight conditions. And it affects the smaller farmers more because a lot of these bailout packages do favor more acreage, so they do favor bigger farms over smaller family farms. Okay, so what does this mean long term? A few things. One, the market share erosion is going to be long lasting. Even when the prices or the exports recover, we might not ever regain the trade that we had prior to this. And just if we're, yes, we might be able to find alternate buyers in Southeast Asia, but no one is ever going to buy on the quantities that China was buying. Also higher input costs and tariff-driven price swings. That compresses margins. It makes it harder to invest in any kind of regenerative practices. It makes it harder for farmers to take risks like the ones that we're doing on our farm where we're cover cropping, eliminating herbicide. And bankruptcy increases means less family farms, and I don't think any of us want to see that. The more that we see farming becoming corporatized, the worse it's going to be for the soil, because we all know that corporations have one thing in mind, and that's bottom line. They don't really care as much about soil. Obviously, they would to the extent that it impacts the yield. But we've just seen that typically corporations don't care about their soil the way that a small family farmer would, especially when that is a generational farmer. So the options that matter for farmers is, we need to start diversifying markets. They need to find buyers outside of China, and they have to invest in differentiated products. So they need to start growing non-GMO. They need to start growing organic. They need to start seeking out alternative crops or creating a market for them. Create a market for heirloom wheat in your area. We also need to see a push for policy that prioritizes farm resiliency and farmer resiliency. And then farmers have to start participating in these trade policy conversations, and they have to do it in a way that's beyond what they've been doing in the past, which, again, this is the piece of all of this that I struggle with the most is farmers are upset, but they're not really doing anything. They're getting together, they're talking about it in coffee shops, but we're not seeing a lot of pushback from farmers. So if you look at France, for example, they're great at striking, they're great at protesting, and those farmers were able to enact change. I quite frankly would love to see that from our farmers. It feels like, as much as they say we want the trade, they kind of tend to sit back and say, well, we'll see what happens. Of course, I'm not talking about every farmer, and not every farmer voted for him. Only 77% did, so almost a quarter actually did not. So what I would say is tighten your cash flow, try to dial back that fertilizer as much as you can. So doing things like we're doing with sap analysis, where we're looking at specifically how much the corn needs or the plant needs at specific times, being very targeted with those applications. So not just blanket applying fertilizer, because that's a pretty volatile input right now. And consider ways to reduce your unit price. So, as much as everyone wants to know, what was your yield on your corn that we grew this way? Yes, yield is important, but also important is bottom line. So yes, we might have had lower yield, but if our revenue is higher because we spent less on inputs, at the end of the day, who cares about the yield if you're making more money? So finding ways to dial back on all of that, switching to inoculants. A lot of this is regenerative products. Switching to inoculants, switching to a focus on the soil health so that we're having to apply less to the soil in order to get better bottom lines. And then, just remember, trade policy is not this abstract thing. We all have a say in all of this. When we vote, when we talk to our politicians, when we make our voices heard or not, ask your representative, what does farm rescue look like to you? Is it just handing out a bailout, or is it actually focusing on efforts that are going to rebuild these markets? So many of the farmers that I talk to say they don't want freebies, they don't want handouts, but then be proactive in helping your politicians see how important it is to rebuild those trade routes. I'm going to link every source that I use down in the description if you want to follow up on any of those. The USDA and FSA production and export data, farm doc analysis. So those are my thoughts for what they're worth. It's fall at the farm. As you can see behind me, most of our leaves are starting to drop here. I'm going to be doing a video on dahlia cleanup and getting our dahlias winterized up next. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, let me know in the comments what you think. I want to hear the goods, the bads, the uglies, all that stuff. But remember, please be kind to each other. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It means a lot to us here at the farm. We'll see you guys around here next time.